The gavel slammed against the judge's bench, sending a sharp crack through the tense courtroom. A low murmur rippled through the spectators, their eyes locked on the man standing alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no legal team, just him. David Carter adjusted the cuffs of his worn jacket, his expression unreadable, as Judge Raymond Calloway leaned forward, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Carter, are you seriously choosing to represent yourself against an entire team of corporate attorneys?" the judge asked, amusement dripping from his tone. A few chuckles echoed from the prosecution's side. David didn't flinch. His fingers tightened around a single folder resting on the table, a folder that held the only thing he needed. Calmly, he met the judge's gaze. "That's correct, Your Honor." Nobody knew it yet, but by the time this trial was over, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. Judge Calloway leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly, amusement still evident in his eyes. Across the room, the prosecution sat poised and confident, led by Gerald Whitman, a high-profile corporate attorney with a reputation for ruthlessly dismantling opponents in court. "Let's not waste time," Whitman said, rising to address the jury. "What we have here is a man who thought he could cheat the system, doctor financial records, and profit at the expense of honest businesses. And now, he thinks he can outsmart the law itself." He gestured toward a mountain of files and evidence binders stacked on his desk. "The prosecution has irrefutable proof of his fraud. We have expert witnesses, financial audits, and undeniable documentation that will leave no doubt in your minds. Mr. Carter isn't just guilty, he's reckless." David sat motionless, his face unreadable, but his knuckles white against the table. The entire courtroom seemed to be against him. The judge, the prosecution, even the whispering spectators who had already decided his fate. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Whitman succeeded, David's reputation, business, and future would be obliterated. But what nobody realized, not Whitman, not the judge, not even the jury, was that David wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. Whitman prowled across the courtroom like a predator that had already smelled blood in the water. His voice was sharp, deliberate, every word a calculated strike. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing toward the tower of documents beside him, "this case isn't complicated. The numbers don't lie. The fraud is right here in black and white." He flipped open a binder, pulling out a stack of spreadsheets covered in dense figures and red markings. These records show deliberate manipulation, false revenue reports, hidden transactions, and altered projections. And if that isn't enough, allow me to introduce our first expert witness. A man in a crisp suit took the stand, testifying with cold precision. He detailed every alleged financial discrepancy, pointing to specific entries that, according to him, proved David had cooked the books. David sat still, hands folded in front of him. But the weight of the attack was immense. Every chart, every statement, every so-called expert. It was a carefully orchestrated takedown, one designed to crush him before he even had a chance to speak. The judge nodded along, clearly biased. Every time the prosecution spoke, he listened intently. But when David so much as shifted in his chair, Calloway barely glanced his way. Then came the first blow. "Your Honor, I move to have this case expedited," Whitman said smoothly. "The evidence is overwhelming. There's no need for unnecessary delays." David stiffened. They weren't just trying to convict him, they were trying to silence him before he could even make his case. The courtroom felt suffocating. The spectators, the reporters, the jury, everyone seemed convinced that David Carter was finished. But then, just as Whitman sat down, David finally moved. Slowly, he stood, adjusting the single folder he had brought with him. The same folder that, in mere moments, would turn this trial upside down. A hush fell over the courtroom as David finally stepped forward, his single folder in hand. "Mr. Whitman," he said calmly, his voice carrying an unshakable confidence. You've done an excellent job of creating a narrative, but let's talk about facts. He placed the folder on the defendant's table and opened it with deliberate precision. You claim these records prove fraud? David continued, gesturing to the prosecution's towering stack of documents. Tell me, did your team even verify the original filings before making these accusations? Whitman's smug expression faltered. The judge leaned in, intrigued despite himself. David held up a single notarized document, its signature glinting under the courtroom lights. These are the official, government-verified records of my company's financial restructuring. What your so-called expert analyzed were internal projections, not actual earnings reports. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whitman's fingers twitched, flipping through his papers, searching for a counterattack. David wasn't finished. And if that wasn't enough, he continued, I have evidence that two of the prosecution's witnesses were, how should I put this, financially motivated. He slid another paper forward. Bank statements. Direct transactions linking Whitman's star witnesses to his corporate rival. Gasps. Shock. Everything shifted in an instant. For the first time, the judge was speechless. Whitman's confidence drained from his face. David leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the prosecutor. Now, should we talk about who's really committing fraud here? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Calloway's smirk had vanished. Prosecutor Whitman sat frozen, his fingers gripping the table as if holding onto a crumbling foundation. David exhaled slowly, his confidence unwavering. Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges, he declared, his voice ringing clear and steady. Judge Calloway hesitated. The weight of the evidence, the undeniable proof of deception, corruption, and false allegations, was too overwhelming to ignore. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as if stalling for time. Mr. Whitman, he finally spoke, his tone noticeably restrained. Do you have any legitimate rebuttal? Whitman opened his mouth, but no words came out. His jaw clenched, his mind racing for an escape route. But there was none. David had outmaneuvered him. The judge sighed, his reluctance evident. In light of the new evidence, this court finds that the case against Mr. Carter lacks merit. All charges are hereby dismissed. A moment of stunned silence. Then, applause erupted from the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing as David allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Judge Calloway shifted uncomfortably, his pride wounded. With a stiff nod, he muttered, Mr. Carter, I misjudged you. David met his gaze, his expression unreadable. No, Your Honor, you underestimated me. With that, he gathered his papers and stood. The prosecutor, the judge, and an entire legal system that had once mocked him were now forced to reckon with the truth. As he strode out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoed against the marble floor, a sound that would not be easily forgotten. Outside, the sky burned with golden hues as the sun dipped low. Justice had been served. But David knew this wasn't just his victory. This was only the beginning. The courtroom doors shut behind David, but the ripple effect of his victory had only just begun. Within hours, news of the case spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the self-taught lawyer who had not only stood his ground against a corrupt system, but had exposed its flaws for the world to see. Law students dissected his strategy. Aspiring lawyers, once intimidated by the profession, found inspiration in his resilience. People who had been wrongfully accused saw a glimmer of hope, realizing that sometimes justice didn't belong to those with the most power, but to those with the most determination. Judge Calloway, once untouchable in his arrogance, found himself at the center of scrutiny. Public trust wavered. Questions arose. How many others had been dismissed, belittled, or denied justice simply because they didn't fit the mold? As David stepped into the golden light of the setting sun, He knew this wasn't just about his triumph. It was about changing the narrative, about proving that intelligence, grit, and truth could dismantle even the most towering walls of injustice. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, with quiet certainty, he murmured to himself, "They laughed at me because they saw a man without a law degree. But I laughed last, because I saw a system that could be beaten with nothing but the truth."